Kanji was delighted to have as a guest, and we're delighted to him for coming, Michael Smith. I first met Michael over the airwaves when he interviewed me on 4BC, and I'd heard a number of interviews on that station, and I was very impressed. I didn't know until Michael appeared on the Alan Jones program about a week ago, when we learned about Michael's past. He'd been a policeman, a regular army soldier. He'd run a business, been the head of a business relating to mobile phones and telephony. He'd been with the Queensland Symphony Orchestra as the chairman of its support base, then I think managed the Queensland Symphony Orchestra, and also had headed as chairman the business school of the University of Queensland. But Michael is especially relevant because he has that very important ingredient for all people, but especially journalists. He has courage. He has the sort of courage which is necessary to ensure that the truth on newsworthy matters is relayed to the Australian people, who are entitled to that truth. And I must say, in comparison with some of the media leaders in Australia, he stands out as a very courageous person. I'm going to ask Michael to explain to the audience why his story, the story he relayed to Alan Jones, is of particular relevance today, and very important that the Australian people know that story and that it be gone into more deeply, perhaps by a Royal Commission.
Thank you, Professor, for asking me along here today. It's great to see you again too. I think this is of fundamental importance to our community, that we have confidence in justice, and that we have confidence in justice for all, and that if you walk past the law courts and see the scales and the good lady holding them, blindfolded, that it's true, that justice is blind and it ought manifestly be seen to be done. There's one element of the community where that's clearly not the case, where the leaders, where the bosses, the entrenched bosses, are able to chart for themselves a course where they get to determine what's right and what's wrong, what's theft and what's not theft, and where they get to dole out favours to the favoured few. And that sector of the community I'm talking about is the union movement. Now, it's important, I think, that we create one little distinction here. I'm not having a go at blokes who get together and combine their forces, their powers, as it were, for better working conditions, for safety and that sort of thing, the blokes on the job sites. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about these entrenched bosses who control the big flows of money that have them elected and re-elected into the powerful positions in unions. And as we have seen in the Michael Williamson case with the Health Services Union, and as I think you can demonstrate in the Australian Workers Union, pretty disgusting, gross largesse, gross misuse of their members' money. Now, you spoke about my time on the radio, Professor, and us first having met there. Well, it was my time on the radio that first sort of alerted me to the malfeasance that seems to be endemic in the union movement, and that was in the Craig Thomson matter, where it was a laid out misere with Craig, just by going on the documents. I worked for the company that Craig had sued for defamation, Mr. Thomson. That was Fairfax, and Fairfax had made some published statements about Thomson's use of a credit card with brothels and what have you. And when you looked at the documents that substantiated Fairfax's assertions against Thomson, it was pretty clear that he had a case to answer. So it just amazed me that over several months it lay dormant, and that Thomson had been able to get away with a statement that he'd sued and, quote, settled that action. That's what he told his parliamentary colleagues. It didn't ring true to me at all. So I just kept at it and at it and at it, kept, if it wasn't for the defence of truth, defaming him by repeating the assertions on the radio. And ultimately, Thomson came on for an interview and, you know, he was given enough rope and he hung himself by the admission that he had authorised the payment by the union of its funds for the purposes of satisfying bills with various brothels and what have you. And ultimately, I think the Thompson matter will proceed. Now that it has been ventilated publicly, I think that it will proceed to a criminal prosecution where the defendant will have to answer his charges, in a court of competent jurisdiction. That will be in Victoria, and the charges will have been preferred under the Crimes Act in Victoria. Now, that brought me to a number of reports of similar malfeasance in the Australian Workers' Union in the 1990s. Keep in mind, I'll try and draw two parallels here. Thompson and the HSU, Bruce Wilson and the Australian Workers' Union in the 1990s. Now, Craig Thompson and the HSU would have had no case to answer had his union benefactor, had the Svengali, Michael Williamson, been successful in smothering the publicity that was associated with Thompson's case. In other words, Williamson, the big union boss, had wanted to keep the investigations into Thompson's matter in-house, had wanted it dealt with only by Fair Work Australia. I was privy to a pre-prepared press release that Mr Williamson sought to have ratified by an executive meeting of the Health Services Union. Had he been successful in that, the Thompson matter would have stayed with Fair Work Australia, and without the publicity associated with it, we'd be unlikely to be talking about a police investigation. I would go into work week in, week out with this mountain of evidence that an ordinary person would look at and say, it's truthful. I can't imagine a circumstance in which a union would levy its members, take money from them, and say it's okay for a union boss like Thompson to use that money for brothels and what have you. Williamson apparently thought it was. Williamson didn't want to see that matter go to the police. I would go into work every day and say on the radio, this bloke's got a case to answer, the police should be on top of it. And police would say back to me, until we have a boss from the union who comes into a police station and makes a statement to say that bloke Thompson used our money and we gave him no permission to use our money for that purpose, until that happens, we police can't take any action. Which brings me to the AWU and Mr Wilson, because it has considerable parallels. We wouldn't be having this discussion now about Bruce Wilson, about the hundreds of thousands of dollars, about the purchase of a house, about the role of his then girlfriend, de facto, call it what you will, in setting up corporate structures that were ultimately used by him, Wilson, to siphon money out of various companies. We wouldn't be having this discussion now if the union leadership at the time had said to police, that man took our money. Here's a statement to that effect. We want to see him charged and the full weight of the law brought to bear on him, and we want our money back. Now, the union didn't do that. In fact, it went considerably further than not simply making the statement of complaint. It went a lot further than that. The union went to the Industrial Relations Court upon the application of Mr Ludwig, Bill Ludwig, then the president, still the president of the union. The union went to the Industrial Relations Court to have the return of money that was initially reported as having been stolen from various entities, to have that return of money back to the people from whom it was reported as having been stolen, declared as an invalidity, and have that money sent back to the union. Now, that was on Bill Ludwig's application, and that's something that Mr Ludwig can answer for himself as to why he did that. What does remain outstanding, though, is that if Bill Ludwig's application to the court to say that the money that was initially reported as having been stolen from those companies, if that was in fact invalid to return that money back, why then is it valid and proper for Wilson to retain the house that he kept with the money that came through that same route? Why then is it proper for Wilson, Bruce Wilson, Ms Gillard's boyfriend at the time, to retain the tens of thousands of dollars in cash that he took through those accounts that were set up, through the original incorporated association?